I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and welcome to night 3 of the 2026 Spring Mini Skein mini series, where every night I am designing some mini Skein sets, multiple colors that could be worked together in one project. Now tonight is going to be all about color mixing, and we're going to do one of my favorite square color mixing grids with a bit of a twist, but we'll get to that in a bit. We're going to be playing with a blue and a green, well, really more of a teal today. Today we're going to play with Paradise Fibers acid dyes, and we're going to use the colors green and blue. And now, while this little blue swatch is very accurate, green, well, it's more of a gorgeous teal, which I love the teal, and that's exactly the color that I want today. But, you know, it isn't like a grass green color. Before I finalize the proportions I want to use for our blue and our green for the grid, I wanted to do a little bit of a test and just do some dip dyeing to blend these two colors together to get a feel for how evenly matched they are, if I think that one of them is severely more potent than the other, and also to get a feel that if I'm using 2 grams of dye on 100 grams of yarn, is that going to be a massive bleeder and something I will regret later on? So let's go do a little test. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves, and measured out 2 grams each of the green and the blue dye, dissolving the dyes in some hot tap water, not worrying about the volume because we're going to use it all on the yarn. Over at the stove, I had 24 cups of water with 6 tablespoons of white vinegar, really hot. I added in our green dye and then brought over 200 grams of our Stroll fingering weight yarn to dip dye into this teal green color. The color didn't absorb mega fast, but within a minute, minute and a half, most of the color was in the yarn. There was still a little bit of color in the dye bath, so I added just a Swish DK yarn mop in, which turned a very nice pale blue. And I left that mop in the dye bath for a little bit to soak up that color before we reset to dye the blue. I shifted the zip ties to where our teal was the darkest, so that way I could start dip dyeing the palest end into our blue dye. And it also seemed to strike mostly within 2 minutes, which was what I was hoping for. If the colors didn't seem to be really binding to the yarn, I could have then brought in more acid. I waited until the water, you could like see through it more. It was less opaque, more translucent. And then I brought over the yarn mop to soak up that last bit of blue dye, bringing our, rough prototype skeins into the steamer basket to steam set for 30 minutes while I was letting the tonal yarn on the bottom absorb that color. I know we didn't end up with 100% of the dye on our dip dyed yarn, but the vast majority of it is there. And so then I knew after the 30 minutes and the yarn had cooled, when I went to go wash it, I could know if there was bleeding and see, okay, how may this compare to our most saturated color later on? Knowing that the majority of the yarn will be dyeing, we'll have a lot less dye per yarn on it. Since there was no color bleeding, this makes me really confident that we can go up to a 2% depth of shade total, or 2 grams of dye per 100 grams of yarn on some of our minis, and that shouldn't cause a problem. Now, that twist I mentioned near the beginning, we're going to be dyeing up twisted skeins today. Rather than going for something more overall tonal, let's take advantage of that resist that we'll get from having our 20 gram minis twisted up. For our prototype, I am going to be locking myself in with a decision a little bit early on because I'm going to be using 4 different yarn bases instead of using 25 minis of all the same base. 3 of the yarn bases are all 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. We have Wool to Dye Force titanium sock, platinum DK. And then we also have Crazy 8 DK, which is 100% superwash merino wool. When I dye these bases together, we tend to get very similar results. So each individual yarn base should not be a super loud indicator that the colors we're mixing are a little bit different, but it could influence it a bit. But I think we should still get a feeling of how our mixed colors will end up. The This will force me to make a decision right away about whether I want our columns to be the sets from the prototype or the rows of our square, because we don't want to mix and match yarn bases in a mini skein set. I popped those loose mini skeins back in our yarn. I'm not going to go ahead and pre-soak the yarn. I'm planning on adding dry yarn into each of our samples. So we should be pretty good to go. I hope. Let's go mix our colors. My goal for our colorway today is to have a set of 5 colors that, yes, transition from green to blue or blue to green, but I also want the intensity of the colors to vary. If I wanted the colors to really just be a hue shift, then I wouldn't need to vary the total amount of dye that's going to be in each container. But because I want to have something less saturated at one end of our set and more saturated at the other end, this is why I'm doing a setup kind of like this, where each color is going to vary from a tiny bit of dye to a lot of dye, and we're going to sort of stack that together. I am going to be talking about the depth of shade of each color independently with these recipes. So for each color, we will have between a 1% depth of shade, which is 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn, and a 0.0625% depth of shade. Now, we could add all these numbers together to get the total dye depth of shade, but for a recipe purpose, this is a way that we can look at these numbers and translate them if and when we need to scale this up. And so I showed you with just the blue, but now here's everything with the blue and the green. So combined, we're gonna have our lightest color in the top left and our deepest color in the bottom right. And I will need to make a decision at some point before we add the yarn if I'm going to want this grid to be sets of rows or sets of columns, but we can always change our mind when we look at how this turns out for when I scale it up. We're almost ready to actually do our color mixing. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves to make our stock solutions. This time I want to pay attention to the volume of water that I'm using. And so I measured out 2.5 grams of each color and then dissolved the dye in 250 milliliters of hot tap water. This gives us a 1% stock solution where we know that 100 milliliters of liquid has 1 gram of dye. So then when we go and we pull 20 milliliters of the sample to use in one of the samples we'll be setting up in a little bit, we know that's going to have 0.2 grams of dye for our 20 gram minis. You don't need to pay close attention to the volume of water you're using if you're going to be using 100% of the dye you weighed out in a kettle like we did earlier. You need to pay more attention if you're wanting to make measurements and create a recipe that you hope to reproduce later on. I set up 25 cups. I believe each is about a quart. They're takeout containers. And I put a cup of water in each of them and 2 teaspoons or about 10 milliliters of white vinegar. I want to have the vinegar in with our dyes before I add the yarn today because I want the dyes to be able to start striking a little faster. We're not going for super even coverage today. And now we can start adding the dyes. Starting with our teal, I'm going to add 20, 10, 5, 2.5, and 1.25 milliliters of our 1% stock solution. Using half of the amount of dye as we had in the previous container is a way to help make sure we do see a visual difference between each color. If we went more of a linear versus a logarithmic way, then you might not see a huge difference between the colors. Logarithmic? Rebecca, what are you talking about? The difference between the first column with the most amount of dye and the last column is dividing the amount of dye in half 4 times. Since we're multiplying by the same number each time we move to a new row, that is giving us a similar step. So on a logarithmic plot, we would have a straight line. But if we're looking at the total grams of dye per grams of yarn, and we're gonna plot it on a traditional plot, then you would see more of a curve. And I'm not explaining this well, but it is a type of progression. I'm not gonna bother stirring things up yet, but it's pretty interesting how things are really staying put a little bit over here. That's not what I'm used to seeing, but anyway, I need to rinse out these graduated syringes that I use to measure. And then we can do the same thing with our blue, but this time we're gonna go on the rows and we're gonna have 20, 10, 5, 2.5, and 1.25 milliliters. Reproducibility is something I struggle with sometimes because when you're doing like a small sample of color and then I want to do the same thing but use maybe 10 times as much dye, I have found that sometimes things can come really close. Other times when I scale it up, it doesn't end up matching exactly the way that I thought it would. And I don't know if I'm propagating an error from the stock solution. When I mixed the blue, I think one of the cups I was using did leak a little bit. And so who knows? That is a factor that could affect a reproducible recipe. If I am, 10% off, which I don't think I'm 10%, but if I'm 2 to 5% off with my measurement for each sample, that is something else that could be propagated when I scale things up. And so this may be something I need to work on further in the future, but I know that whatever I have going on here is going to get me into the ballpark of what I would like to see. Looking at all these colors now, I honestly would not be able to tell you what is the most dominant color. And by that, because we have our most blue down there and our most teal over here. And so is everything going to feel more teal, more blue, somewhere in the middle? But I think I'm going to add our minis in rows. And let's start with our titanium. Going to grab it and pop it in, and we can't see anything yet. I'm going to have to rinse off that spoon. Because our yarn is dry, and all these yarns are pretty absorbent in general, but maybe also with it cold, this may not work as well as I thought. Oh dear. Oh dear. Now, because the yarn is twisted, it's also going to take some time for the color to absorb. More time than it would. I may end up having to steam set things in these containers, which is doable. But, sometimes things are a really good idea in theory, but then in practice, may not work out quite as well. Now, this sample here has the least amount of blue, so it's the most like teal everywhere. Okay, that one's soaked in fine. Oops, I did a mistake. So see, since the amount of blue is the same in all of these, right? But the amount of teal increases. So it's okay for me to go from one container to the next, but I shouldn't go backwards. They're sinking in. It's just taking a little bit of time. Next up, we have our Crazy 8, which is actually going to go into 2 of our rows. Now, I've actually only dyed a 20-gram mini skein with this technique, I think once, really. Goodness. Because the last time I did this, it was on 10-gram minis for Hanukkah, and then in a follow-up video, I did use a 10-gram mini once. Huh. But anyway, this is going to take a little while. So you know what? I think we're going to move into a time lapse here. And I will film a voiceover. So here we've mixed 2 colors that are pretty similar because we've got like a teal green and a blue. But we know that the colors do read different, and I'm so curious to see how things will feel once we've absorbed some of that color. Because I'll say right now, a lot of these feel very similar to me, but I think that they'll feel more different later on. Like, Yeah, well, who knows? Who knows? We may edit and do something a little more extreme one way or the other. That we'll just have to wait and see. I am a little nervous, not by the depth of the color, but that things aren't soaking in quickly. And I don't know if this is going to work. And that makes me nervous. But, you know, even if we end up with things that are very tonal overall and we don't have a lot of resist remaining, that's okay. I just think that we have a chance that we might see something cool. Maybe I do need to add more acid though. Before I go ahead and put the lids on, I am gonna add another teaspoon of white vinegar to each container. Now, we're at room temperature. I did not expect to see colors starting to strike to the yarn, but I'm going to be leaving this at room temperature for a couple of days so everything can cold process. This is something that typically allows me to set up 25 different colors all at once, and I find really handy. But I did mention, oh, I might need to steam set these containers. I can pop these containers into a steamer basket to heat set the yarn directly in them if I need to, but again, that can take a while. So the plan is to set everything at room temperature, or if it's warm enough outside, set it up outside, and let it sit for a couple of days. And then by that time, most of the color should have absorbed to the yarn. At least that is what would happen if the yarn wasn't twisted. With it twisted, all bets are off. I don't know how quickly this will go. But now I can actually come in with the lids, and a bunch of my lids already have numbers on them. I may need to renumber some of them. And I'm gonna pop the lids on and set everything aside, leaving all of these in a secondary container so we don't stain anything. So I'll see you in a couple of days. It has been a few days. It is now a Friday, and I have a couple interesting observations. One is that when we have our 1% blue, the color has nearly absorbed, and there's mostly absorbed with the teal, but there's some left. Let's remove the lids and I'll show you this. Okay, now that everything is open, this blue is incredible. So there's a tiny bit of color in there, but if we compare it to our teal, like a lot of the color is in our yarn. There's just some color left there. And I think that this is a trend that we'll see. The more color is left, well, I mean, that's like a 2% depth of shade. There's more color down this way. So I think what I'm inclined to do is steam set the yarn while it is twisted, just because this way I don't need to have it as many of the yarns be in contact with each other. And then I can open it up once we've already heat set it. And what I mean by having the yarns in contact with each other is right now each mini is sort of next to a neighbor in here. And if I had them untwisted, more of it would be touching. And so I'm able to make like a cute, actually a super cute little circle, which would be a fun way. I mean, these are two different yarn bases. It'd be a fun way to put these two sets together. But now I'm going to steam set this for 30 minutes. And I think this time I'm going to go for the bottom one. And you can see there really isn't that much pigment remaining. Now, I still don't know, and I've pulled the yarn for what I'm going to do for the next batch. Ooh, I love this deepest one. Oh, I don't love that I love this deepest one, but I love this deepest one. It is so subtle. Oh my gosh. That is gorge. That is absolutely gorge. Yeah, I would say that especially, it's weird that this one has so much more than that one, but otherwise I have a feeling it's going to fall some kind of trend. And I may bring over a yarn mop But what I haven't decided yet is, even though like I love these great progressions that we have here, and you know what? We may as well remove it now. I can add it to a steamer basket later on. Ooh, I see resist. I have intentionally put things together so that way we don't have, I think it was it 2 of the Crazy 8s? There was one base that I had 2 of, and I just don't want to mix it up because I have a feeling that a lot of these colors are going to be very, very subtle. There's a lot of the green left. This progression is really lovely, but I'm almost feeling like I may want to, rather than having the blue constant and increasing the teal, I may want to hold the teal constant and increase the blue and sort of do the opposite of what I've done for these particular sets. But I do really like this one right here. I think that that is really pretty. I don't feel like the color, especially because there's so much of the green that is left, I don't know if the things are getting feeling like they're getting darker and more intense as we get more teal. And so that's why my gut is thinking that maybe we would pick one of the sets that go that way. But I will wait until we see them dry and we can set up this grid again to finalize this. Part of me was going to do it today, and I decided I don't think that's the way it's going to go down. So once 30 minutes are up, we will swap what's in the steamer basket. You know what I just realized? Sometimes I like to stick my yarn in to a steamer basket this way, even if my minis were not twisted when I went into the thing. But it's okay if things are a little out of order. Very pretty. All right, I'm gonna set this aside to cool completely. And in the meantime, add the other minis that we still need to dye. And I think that our color progressions are cool. I'm really, really excited to see how much, if any, white is left behind. And it may be a really cool transition when we see more of it with the blue and less with the teal. I don't know. I'm excited. I emptied out my second dye bath and then started bringing over some of the liquid that still had pigment in it. And it also had acid in there as well. Because I figured, why leave this behind? And I was curious with what we might end up with. Now, early in the process, I brought over a skein, another skein of Knit Pick Stroll Fingering Weight yarn, added it into the pot, and then started pouring more of the colors on top of it, just to see what we would get. Once I added all the color, I heat everything for 30 minutes, and then remove the yarn to set it aside to cool, and then I could wash it off camera. Everything is still wet, so some of the subtle differences will be less subtle when we move forward. But I think I'm considering this right here. Yeah, I think that we've got like a good shift and mix of the colors. This is a really good in between the two. And like this is pretty. It's very, very teal. This is completely teal. This one is also very teal. So I'm thinking I like either this round or maybe this round, I think, are my two favorites. But now I'm going to untwist all of the minis and bring them into bundles. I love that the more pigmented the overall color was, the less white we have in there, because the dye was able to soak in a little further, and I just think that that was fun. This looks pretty just as it is. I love, love, love that we have all these tonals. And this one is a little more monochromatic, and then as we get down, there's more and more blue. I adore this deep one, but my vision really did have like the intensity of the colors change. I wanted something to go from less saturated to more saturated, kind of like we have in here, but while also shifting tone. So we'll again wait to see them dry and I'll make my final choice. But now we can go ahead and wash it. We're just gonna wash 200 grams right now. Once we go ahead and scale this up, we're gonna be dyeing 200 grams of yarn in each color to do 10 sets. And I'm planning on doing that hot. There's a little bit of color in there, but that's really not much. And these were the two samples that have the most amount of dye, probably. Yes, they're the most pigmented ones. But when we set this up hot, we will get some differences. We're more likely to see similar amounts of white in all of the yarns, but also that's not necessarily the case. And so I'm excited to see like how it might change or be different. But since I'm thinking these sets are all going to be completely unique from the next round we do, I think that will play in as well. But anyway, things are looking great. I'm going to put the yarn through my spin dryer, hang it up to dry. We'll wash the rest off camera. Let's lay out our prototype, and I am so excited by this modeling we're seeing, whether or not there's white. I'm so happy. This is so pretty. It is very clear that the green seems to be a lot more dominant. And one of the ways that we know that is that on our darkest green, I'm not seeing a huge shift as we go down the vertical. Because here we had our green constant and we're adding more and more and more blue. If we look at the blue along the bottom, from far away, it may not look like there's a lot of shift, but there is. There's more of a shift there than we had with the greens. Theoretically on camera, it's looking a little different. But anyway, the two sets that I was considering while things were wet were this one right here or this one right there. I think those both give a good balance of the amount of blue, and I am more inclined to kind of lean into this vertical right here where we keep our green constant and then vary the blue. And that is because I think that set has more of we start lighter and we're increasing the intensity of color versus the other one where things feel more evenly saturated. But here are our prototype sets all twisted up, and well, let's jump in and dye the rest. The second batch has a lot of different yarns. We have a zebra yarn, a yak blend. We have neon neps with and without sparkles. We have an iridescent sparkle. We have a silver sparkle. And so we're going to be dyeing each bundle of 10 all in one of our colors. I made some fresh 1% dye stocks off camera. And of course I wore my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves while dealing with the dry dye powder. For the green, I made 250 milliliters of the stock. And for the blue, I made 500 milliliters of our 1% stock solution. And just as a reminder, a 1% stock solution has 1 gram of dye per 100 milliliters of liquid. Now what you're watching me do right here is measure out the stock solution and aliquot the amount of dye I will need for our 5 different colors. I measured out 25 milliliters of our green dye stock 5 times because each of our colors will have the exact same amount of green in there. Next, I went to measuring out our blue dye, and I'm using mostly graduated cylinders here because I'm using larger volumes of liquid, but I could have used for the smaller volumes a syringe again. And for the blue, I measured out 12.5 milliliters, 25 milliliters, 50 milliliters, 100 milliliters, and then 200 milliliters of our 1% stock solution. If we go and take a look again at the original recipe, all I have done is multiply each of the numbers I used originally by 10. And this is because I will be dyeing 200 grams of yarn in each color instead of 20 grams of yarn. I don't know how reproducible things will be, but hopefully, hopefully we'll get close to what I was going for. For our dye baths, I started with 16 cups of water and 4 tablespoons of white vinegar. And starting with the lightest color, I added in the dye I mixed, rinsed the cup out, and then added our dry, twisted mini skeins. We have 10 20-gram minis going into each pot. And then I set a timer for 30 minutes. Knowing that there could be some dye left in the dye bath, I may increase acid as we go on. I'm planning on reusing these dye baths for the later samples, but I'm very excited to see how things will turn out. Now, it's very possible that our colors are going to look different for a number of reasons. It's possible that with the hot dye baths, the color will strike a lot faster. I mean, it's very likely that that'll happen. And so we could see more resist in our darker colors than what we saw before. And there's some other possibilities of what can happen as well. But rather than trying to predict everything, we'll wait and see how the finished yarn comes out. I did use a yarn mop as needed to soak up the leftover color before going on to our next sample. All of the yarns were really absorbent, but the one that needed a little bit more help going into the dye baths was the zebra base, which surprised me, to be honest. After letting the yarn cool, I untwisted everything and added zip ties, keeping our color families together. We will separate them once everything is dry. I washed all the yarn off camera, hung it up to dry. I wanted to create some sock blanks inspired by our grid. And I decided to do dip dyeing, which would still give us a bit of a gradient, but in a not as expected way, even though I've done this once before. I set up a dye bath with 24 cups of water, 6 tablespoons of white vinegar, and I added what was left of, and I added about 45 to 50 milliliters of our blue acid dye. Now, the thing that concerned me here was that there were only about 45 milliliters of this dye left when I would have expected maybe closer to 60. Now, there is some waste with what's left over in a cup or in a syringe, but this is worth remembering for the future for measuring difficulties. But anyway, I held 2 sock blanks horizontally and dip dyed them into the blue dye to give us a gradient of blues across the width of these blanks. Now, sock blanks are pre-knit pieces of fabric that are dyed with the intent for you to unravel them later on. So whatever asymmetric pattern we get, we can have an asymmetric yarn that we unravel in the end. And these blanks happen to be double-stranded, which means when we unravel them, we'll get 2 matched 50-gram balls of yarn. Once I was satisfied with the amount of blue that I had on the blanks, I removed the yarn from the dye bath, not worrying about the dye that was left in there. I can add a yarn mop to clear out the leftover blue dye before bringing over our green dye. With our green dye, I had much closer to 50 milliliters of that liquid. I added it to the same dye bath that was then cleared, and then dipped our sock blanks in, making a lengthwise gradient of this teal green color. And since these blanks are double-stranded, as I mentioned, it doesn't matter if one blank gets dipped in faster than the other, because each will have a matched pair of yarn to itself, which gives you a really nice amount of control there, because it's nice that you can end up with gradients and color transitions that happen in the same place. And once again, I dip dyed until I was satisfied with the color coverage. Now, because I may not want to leave the blank in the dye bath for a long period of time to absorb all the color and lose some of our gradient, I will go ahead and steam set these blanks for 30 minutes off camera, just to make sure all the colors are well set. And then I'll wash and hang them up to dry off camera so we can look at the finished yarn. This is exactly what I was hoping for. We have like a light teal, almost dusty because it's not that saturated, that the color increases in intensity, but also gets bluer and bluer as we go to our darkest yarn that's over at the end. And we have this modeling from the Twisted Skeins, and so just mwah, chef's kiss. I adore it. Once things are twisted up again, we can compare this slightly to the sets we had before, or at least our grid and our goal, but without taking a close look at the grid right now, I'm feeling like this is what I wanted, and so I'm thrilled. The sock blanks we dyed for this video are really cool because I dip dyed the yarn into the blue, sort of widthwise, and then did the lengthwise dip dye into the teal. And I don't know how well it's showing up on camera, but at our deep end, there's definitely a shift in hue. It's just very, very subtle. Now this is going to knit up differently from our mini skein sets. If I wanted something closer to our mini skein sets, I would dye the blank at whatever the amount, I don't remember the dye amounts off the top of my head, but editing Rebecca was going to pop it up on the screen. I would do a tonal layer of the entire blank in that little amount of teal. And then I would dip dye into our blue. And that would give us a progression that is overall similar in tone to our mini skein progression here. But the modeling that we have will be different. And right now I'm showing you one of these sock blanks that's unraveled and some close-ups so you can see there is some resist from the knit stitches. It is a much smaller scale than the resist we had from our twisted skeins. But for the first time, it feels like, oh, yes, there's resist in the blank and resist in our yarn. And so that's kind of fun. I didn't even realize that the blanks were dyed at sort of like a mirror image orientation. That's pretty fun. You can really see the variegation that goes across the blank in these little stripes that you see along here, which are way more subtle down at this deep end, but there is technically variation in there. It's just way more subtle down here than it is over here where we have more of an extreme difference. Now the effect that we're going to get on our sock blank is actually pretty different from the effect of the skeins I dip dyed at the beginning of the video. And that's because here we have a smooth transition between the colors that, yes, are much darker than what we used otherwise, but we have a smooth transition without any modeling or breaks. And so I think that if you wanted to be able to use a sock blank to get an effect more like this, it would be hard. I would be inclined to make a series of connected mini skeins and then to mix, I'd probably go more than 5. I'd mix like 10 different colors to dye the connected minis to try to get a smooth, saturated gradient without any modeling to it. We have a lot of different bonus skeins from this video at various points soaking up the dye leftovers that we had. Or in one case, this one is the most different. We went ahead and had like dye on the counter and we just cleaned up around anyway. But the fun thing is that all of these more pale blues, they all go really nicely with our mini skein sets. Now, I think none of them are the same yarn base as one of the ones in the set, but things being the same yarn base doesn't mean you can't mix them together in a project. If you have things that have similar yardage and weights, you can absolutely combine different yarn lines. But I just like how that blue goes along with everything. Now I need to go start twisting everything up so we can sort these into the different yarn bases. Our minis are all laid out so that way each row is one yarn base. And I think that there is one base that really stands out that I have towards the middle. And that is our That Yak. But even there, and I'll arrange and we'll look at different sets individually in a little bit. But because the base started off darker, that one is definitely standing out from the bunch. The other two bases that are really standing out are our two bases with the neon neps. One of them has some mermaid sparkle, one doesn't. And when we have a little bit less dye, the base definitely feels more yellow. And that's just because of all these warm toned colors. There's a little bit of strands of that running throughout the yarn. But as we go to the two most blue colors, now we're not really feeling that yellow coming through just because there's a ton more pigment present. One other honorable mention is that the Mermaid Stellina, which is like an iridescent pink and green, pink, orange, and green kind of color, is so cool on the blue. It's also really cool on the lightest color. It's a little more subtle over here. The way I have the light in here, you can't really see the sparkle, but I promise it's very sparkly. I didn't specifically highlight that zebra base that has the black strand running through it. Obviously that does stand out from the others as well, but it's really the neon net bases that are again on the far right and that yak that really look very different. Here we have our 10 sets that we dyed very specifically, and then the 5 sets that we dyed originally, which none of them match what we have here because I picked an opposite direction of I picked a column versus rows, however I had set it up, which I think is fun because that means it's a little bit more of a surprise of what colorway you'll be opening up. Our sock blank may not match any of the sets exactly, but I think if I'm bringing this over, maybe it's the most like this one right here with the dark teal all the way to sort of the lighter blue with bits of white. I think that that is the one that sort of matches the closest with the gradient that we have from the blank. But again, the blank represents more of the grid overall. When I went and grabbed a mini skein set for the conclusions, I realized I'm like, okay, I think this is one of the sets from the scale up, but I honestly can't say for sure. I'm pretty sure it's one of the sets from our scale up though. It was so much fun doing another variation of this color mixing exercise that I love to do. This is something that can just be really handy. I've done it a lot with shades of black, mixing black with different colors to get a feel for the different neutrals and dustier versions of those colors you can create. And it just gives me a reference to go back to. So that way I know, okay, I want to take these colors and mix this like ocean blue color in the middle. I can feel out of proportion to at least start with. Now I did mention along the video that reproducibility is something that sometimes I struggle with. And that doesn't necessarily mean that my math is wrong along the way, although it could be. But there also, when I'm using different instruments to measure dyes, using a graduated cylinder versus a syringe, there could be, I guess, more differences in how things get measured out that could also be a source of some of the differences that I end up seeing. But maybe someday we'll play around and I could do it with some live streams and we'll try, okay, let's do the same recipe over and over and over and see how close we get. But again, this is even an industry problem because when we talk about dye lots of different colors, that is something that can come up. Following the same recipe to get the same color, sometimes things can just be slightly different. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits and I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you love the yarn I dyed and want to bring home some SMSMS yarns yourself, go and check out the listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. My shop is also filled with other hand-dyed yarn that's been featured in my videos, and so it's worth going and checking that out. But by far the biggest thing you can do to help support all the content here is subscribe. Subscribe, turn on notifications, leave a comment below. The more you engage with the videos, the more the almighty algorithm might recommend my videos to someone else, and the algorithm's changing again, so I'm pretty nervous. But I love what I do and I love sharing these projects with you, and so I really hope that comes across in these videos. And now's the time when I have to ask you, what do you think I'm going to be dyeing up for night 4 of the 2026 Spring Mini Skein mini series. Tomorrow night is the last night I will be dyeing mini skein sets. Night 5 will feature a bonus colorway on full skeins of yarn. This year they all have a mermaid sparkle in it, and so that's going to be really, really fun. And then we'll have the behind the scenes vlog where you can see a lot of stuff that went on behind the scenes of making these videos, including some stuff that you may not expect happened in this particular video. I can't wait for you to see all of this. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you tomorrow night.